I was taking a cross-country bus trip, one of those long-haul rides where you see the same people for days as you make your way across states. It was my first time doing anything like this, and I had planned to spend most of it listening to music and watching the scenery roll by. For the first few hours, everything was fine. People kept to themselves, heads buried in books or resting on folded jackets. The atmosphere was quiet, calm. Around the second night, a man boarded at a small-town stop. He looked disheveled, wearing a faded coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. His hair was unkempt, his eyes sunken with dark circles underneath. He sat down across the aisle from me, and I felt an immediate discomfort settle over me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. He didn't look at me, just stared out the window, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the seat in front of him. I tried to ignore him, telling myself he was just another passenger, but every time I looked up, he was watching me, his eyes shifting away the moment we made eye contact. It was subtle at first, but soon I could feel his gaze lingering. He'd glance over, fixate on me for a moment, then return to staring out the window, as if he were waiting for something. That night, while most of the bus was asleep, I felt something brush against my shoulder. I turned, startled, to see the man leaning into my aisle, his face inches from mine. He whispered, asking if I was traveling alone. I didn't respond, just shook my head and turned back to my seat, hoping he'd get the hint. He leaned back but kept staring, his gaze unblinking, unnerving. At the next rest stop, I quickly got off the bus to get some air. As I walked around, I saw him again, standing near the vending machines, just staring at me. When he noticed I'd seen him, he didn't look away. Instead, he raised his hand in a slow wave, his eyes wide and unblinking. I backed away, feeling a chill settle over me, and hurried back to the bus, hoping to get as far away from him as possible. When the bus started moving again, he didn't sit back down in his original seat. Instead, he moved to the seat directly behind me. I could feel his presence, like a shadow hanging over me, his breath slow and steady. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and pretending to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaning forward, watching, waiting for something. Hours passed like that, tense and unnerving. Finally, as we neared my stop, I decided I'd had enough. I got up to move closer to the front of the bus, hoping to put some distance between us. As I did, he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and cold. He whispered, telling me that I couldn't leave yet, that we still had things to discuss. I yanked my arm free, stumbling down the aisle to the driver, and told him what had happened. The driver looked back, but the man just sat there, eyes wide and blank, as if he hadn't done a thing. The driver nodded, told me to sit up front, and promised to keep an eye on him. When we finally pulled into the station, I practically ran off the bus, not daring to look back. But as I stepped onto the platform, I felt that same cold grip on my arm. I turned, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just a faint outline of a shadow retreating back into the bus. I haven't taken a bus trip since, and sometimes, in the dark of the night, I still feel that cold hand gripping my arm, like he's still out there, waiting for our unfinished conversation. When I was 12, my family took a trip to a small coastal town for a summer vacation. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, and we were clearly the outsiders. We rented a small cabin by the beach, and every morning I'd go down to the shore to collect shells and wade in the water, while my parents got ready for the day. One morning, while I was out alone on the sand, a man approached me. He looked to be in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a tan, weathered face. He wore a thick fisherman's sweater, even though it was already getting warm. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. He asked if I was enjoying the beach, and I nodded, trying to seem polite but not inviting conversation. He seemed harmless, just another friendly local, so I figured he'd leave after a few words. Instead, he crouched down beside me, reaching for a shell at my feet. He held it up and told me it was a special shell, one that only appeared on this particular beach. He said it was called a ghost shell, and that people believed it carried the voices of those who had disappeared at sea. He placed it in my hand, closing my fingers around it, and told me I should keep it safe. I felt a chill run through me, but I thanked him and pocketed the shell, hoping he'd leave. But he didn't. Instead, he kept talking, telling me about all the people who'd gone missing on this beach over the years. He said most of them were children, like me, who had wandered too far along the shore. He said their families had looked everywhere but never found them. They were simply gone. I didn't want to hear any more. I told him I had to go and turned to head back to the cabin, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, and his fingers dug into my skin. He told me to be careful, that the sea could be a cruel thing, that it could take you when you least expected it. He looked at me with a strange intensity, his eyes dark and serious, and I felt trapped, unable to pull away. Finally, I managed to twist free, mumbling an excuse as I hurried up the beach toward the cabin. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire way. When I reached the cabin, I told my parents about the man, but they brushed it off, saying he was probably just a lonely local trying to make conversation. I stayed away from the beach for the rest of the trip, only going down when my parents were with me. The last day before we left, I found the shell he had given me tucked in my bag. I hadn't remembered putting it there, but I didn't think much of it. I decided to keep it, though it still gave me a weird feeling. Years later, while cleaning out an old drawer, I came across the shell again. It made me remember this whole story, and I felt lucky to have gotten out of that situation in one piece. I tossed the shell back into the drawer, and every now and again the image of that old man still pops into my head. A few years ago, I worked at a small-town convenience store, covering the late shift. The place was isolated, a single fluorescent light illuminating the cracked parking lot. Nights were usually quiet, just a handful of customers looking for snacks or gas. But one night around 3 a.m., a man walked in, and from the moment he crossed the threshold, I felt the atmosphere change. He was tall and thin, with a face that looked stretched, as if his skin didn't quite fit right. His clothes were dirty, tattered, and there was something off about the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, as if he were taking his time studying every item on the shelves. I stayed behind the counter, watching him as he made his way up and down each aisle, barely touching anything. Eventually, he walked over to the counter, placed a single can of soda down, and looked at me without saying a word. His eyes were wide, almost unblinking, and he had the faintest trace of a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. I tried to keep calm as I rang him up, silently hoping he would just take the soda and leave. As I handed him his change, he grabbed my wrist, his grip ice-cold firm. He asked if I had a minute to talk, his voice soft and unsettling, like a whisper that was somehow too close. I forced a smile, told him I was busy with work, but he didn't let go. He leaned in closer, his eyes locked on mine, and asked if I believed in fate, in chance encounters. I shook my head, trying to pull my hand free, but his grip tightened. He told me, in that same low voice, that we were meant to meet, that he had been waiting for me as if he knew me somehow. I finally managed to yank my wrist away, taking a few steps back, keeping the counter between us. For a moment he just stared, his gaze unblinking, that eerie smile still on his face. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the can of soda on the counter. I watched him through the window as he walked slowly across the parking lot, disappearing into the shadows beyond the streetlights. I thought that was the end of it, just a creepy encounter I could shake off. But when my shift ended and I walked to my car, I found something on the windshield. A note written in a shaky, uneven script. It reads, "See you soon." I never saw him again, but for months after I felt watched, always glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see his face in the shadows. I quit that job not long after, and even now, I keep that note locked away as a reminder that some encounters are better left forgotten. When I was around 8, my mom would take me with her to run errands after school. She worked long hours, so it was easier for her to get things done if I just tagged along. One afternoon, she stopped by the local bank to handle some paperwork, and I sat in one of the plastic chairs near the entrance, swinging my legs and watching people go by. That's when I noticed a man standing outside the glass doors, staring straight at me. At first, I thought he was just looking into the bank, but his gaze was steady, unblinking, and fixed right on me. He wore a dark coat and had a scruffy beard, his face shadowed by a baseball cap pulled low. Something about him felt wrong. I looked away, hoping he'd leave, but when I glanced back, he was still there, his eyes never leaving mine. After what felt like forever, he turned and walked away. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. When my mom and I left the bank, I saw him standing across the street, watching us. I tugged on my mom's sleeve and whispered that a strange man was staring at us, but she brushed it off, saying he was probably just waiting for someone. Over the next few weeks, I saw him everywhere. Outside my school, near our grocery store, even at the park when I was playing with friends. He never approached me, never said a word, but his presence was constant, his eyes following me whenever I looked up. I told my mom again, but she thought I was imagining things. She said it was probably just a coincidence. One evening, we went to a family gathering at my aunt's house. My cousins and I were playing in the backyard, laughing and running around, when I felt that same unsettling feeling. I looked over the fence, and there he was, standing on the sidewalk, watching. Panic bubbled up inside me, and I ran inside, telling my mom again. This time, she saw how terrified I was and decided to call the police. The officers took my statement and asked if I could describe him. They told me to be careful, to stay with my mom at all times, and to let them know if I saw him again. I didn't see him for a while after that, and I thought maybe he'd finally moved on. I tried to forget about it, convincing myself that I'd just imagined the whole thing, that maybe it was just some harmless guy who happened to be around a lot. But one night, weeks later, I woke up to a tapping sound on my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen, too scared to move. Slowly, I turned my head, and through the curtains I saw a dark shape, a man's silhouette backlit by the street lamp. I knew it was him. He was just standing there, looking in. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited, my breath shallow, praying he'd go away. When I opened my eyes again, he was gone, but I knew he had been there, watching. I told my mom the next morning, but she didn't know what to do. We moved a few months later for reasons unrelated to the man, and I never saw him again. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'll hear that tapping on the window again. I'll never forget his face, or the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for something, like he knew where I was even before I did. In high school, I used to take the bus home every day. The route was long, winding through quiet roads and empty fields, but I didn't mind. By the time we reached my stop, the bus was nearly empty, leaving me to enjoy the peace. I'd put on my headphones, get lost in music, and watch the scenery pass by. One evening in the fall, as the bus pulled to a stop, a man climbed on, and right away, I felt something off about him. He looked a little older than me, maybe in his 20s, dressed in a worn hoodie and jeans. Instead of sitting near the front like most people did when the bus was empty, he walked straight to the back and sat just a few rows behind me. I could feel his eyes on me, this silent, heavy presence that pressed in like a weight. As we drove on, I kept telling myself he'd get off soon, maybe at one of the last stops before mine. But as we passed stop after stop, he didn't move. He just sat there staring. My skin prickled, and I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. When we finally neared my stop, I pulled the cord, telling myself I'd lose him on the walk home. The bus slowed, and I gathered my things, glancing back quickly. He stayed seated, looking down, and I felt a wave of relief as I stepped off. But as the bus pulled away, I heard footsteps. I turned, and there he was, standing a few yards down the road, watching me. I froze, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he started walking toward me, his eyes fixed on me, his face blank. I told myself not to panic, to act normal. I pulled out my phone, pretending to scroll, and quickened my pace. As I neared my street, I glanced back. He was still there, walking faster now, closing the distance. My heart pounded as I reached my driveway, but I forced myself to keep calm, trying not to show my fear. I fumbled with my keys, turning to face him, and I asked if I could help him. He stopped a few steps away, staring at me, his expression unreadable. Then he asked in a low voice if Emily was here. I shook my head and told him no one named Emily lived here. His eyes narrowed, like he didn't believe me, but after a long pause he turned and walked away. I stayed rooted to the spot, watching him disappear down the street, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. When I went inside, I locked every door, telling myself I'd never see him again. But 2 days later, there he was again, standing by a tree near the bus stop. This time he didn't follow me. He just stood there, watching, his face blank. I walked home as quickly as I could, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his gaze burning into my back the whole way. Over the next few weeks, I saw him regularly. He'd stand at the bus stop or linger by a tree near my house, always watching. Sometimes he was just far enough away that I wondered if I was imagining it, but every time I glanced back, he was there, his eyes following me. I kept telling myself he was probably harmless, just some guy with nowhere else to go. But the way he watched me made my skin crawl. One night, after about a month of this, I woke up to a faint noise outside my window, a soft rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. I sat up, heart pounding, and crept over to the window. In the dim light from the street lamp, I saw him standing just outside the fence, looking up at my window. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, grabbing my phone to call my dad. I told him someone was outside, and he rushed into my room, looking out the window. By the time he got there, the man was gone. My dad called the police, and they took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do without evidence of a crime. They told me to call them if I saw him again, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. For a while, things were quiet. I didn't see him at the bus stop, and I convinced myself he'd finally moved on. But one day, as I was walking home, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A small, torn piece of fabric caught on the fence near my window. It was the same color as the hoodie he always wore. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every creak and groan of the house set my nerves on edge, and I kept imagining him out there, watching, waiting. I never told my parents about the piece of fabric. I didn't want to worry them more than they already were. But from that day on, I changed my routine. I started taking a different route home, and I avoided going out alone after dark. Even now, years later, I still glance over my shoulder when I walk alone at night, half expecting to see him standing there watching. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never feel completely safe in my own neighborhood again. When I was in college, I worked the night shift at a gas station just off the highway. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it helped pay the bills, and most nights were uneventful. The occasional trucker would stop in for a coffee, or some college kid would come in for snacks, but for the most part, it was quiet. One night, around 2 a.m., I was restocking the shelves when I heard the chime of the door. I looked up, expecting another weary traveler, but instead, a man I'd never seen before walked in. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and eyes that seemed too intense for the middle of the night. He didn't look like the usual customers. Something about him was off. But I shrugged it off, figuring he was just passing through. The man wandered around the store for a while, glancing at the shelves but never picking anything up. I kept an eye on him, feeling a growing unease as he moved closer to the counter. Finally, he walked up to me, his eyes locked on mine in a way that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at me, as if studying my face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and scratchy. He asked if I was working alone. I forced a polite smile, lying as I said that the other employee was on a break. He nodded, his eyes still boring into mine, and said that it was good to have company on a quiet night like this. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, and every instinct in me screamed that I needed to be careful. I tried to keep things casual, asking if he needed help finding something, but he just shook his head, his gaze drifting around the store. He lingered for what felt like hours, glancing at the security cameras and the exits as if memorizing the layout. I kept my hand near the phone, ready to call someone if I needed to, but he never made a move. Finally, he asked if there was a restroom he could use. I told him it was out of order, which wasn't entirely true, but I didn't want him wandering into the back of the store where it was just the two of us. He just nodded, a strange smile playing on his lips, and said he'd find one elsewhere. But before he left, he looked at me again, and I'll never forget his words. You should be careful who you trust in the dead of night. Not everyone is who they seem to be. With that, he turned and walked out, disappearing into the dark. I watched him go, relief flooding me as the door closed behind him. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was just a weird guy passing through, but something about the encounter lingered, a prickling sense of dread that I couldn't shake. About half an hour later, another man came in, this time an older guy who looked like he'd just come off a long drive. He seemed friendly enough, grabbing a coffee and making small talk while he paid. I mentioned the strange man from earlier, and the old guy's face grew serious. You're lucky he didn't stick around, he said. There's been a guy fitting that description who's been going up and down the highway, getting into trouble at places just like this. They say he likes to find people working alone. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes they turn up days later, but they're never quite the same. A cold chill ran through me as I realized just how close I'd come to something terrible. I didn't sleep that morning, and I quit the night shift soon after, switching to daytime hours no matter how much it messed up my schedule. I never saw the man again, but his warning still echoes in my mind. Be careful who you trust in the dead of night. There was something.